50 rejections. 50 sterile offices where men in bespoke suits sneered at her patched coat and tossed her degree into the trash. They wanted pedigree. They wanted pliant perfection. She just wanted to pay rent. Then came the man in the blood-spattered Oxford, offering 6 figures to watch his son. The rain in Chicago didn't fall. It spat. It drove sideways against the bus windows, turning the city into a grey, smeared blur. Fiona sat near the back, her wet boots pooling dirty water onto the rubber floor mat. She stared at the manila folder in her lap. Inside was her life, neatly summarized on heavy stock paper. A degree in early childhood development, 4 years of experience at a respectable, mid-tier daycare. Glowing letters of recommendation. It meant absolutely nothing to the zip codes that started with 600. She had just come from the Gold Coast. The interview had been with a tech startup founder named Gavin, a man who wore a $2,000 cashmere hoodie and drank something green from a glass bottle. He had looked at Fiona's worn loafers, glanced at her resume, and asked if she was fluent in Mandarin. When she said no, he had sighed, as if she had personally offended his infant daughter's future Ivy League prospects. Before Gavin, it was the Westons. They wanted a nanny who was also a certified sommelier and willing to surrender her passport to them for security reasons. Fiona rested her head against the vibrating glass of the bus window. The truth was simple. The ultra-rich didn't want a caregiver. They wanted an accessory. They wanted someone who looked like they belonged in a Ralph Lauren catalogue, not someone who knew how to stretch a box of generic mac and cheese over 3 days. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from her landlord. Rent is 4 days late. Pink slip goes on the door tomorrow. Sorry, kid. Fiona closed her eyes. The exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. She had $74 in her checking account. The math was brutal and unforgiving. When she finally pushed open the door to her cramped apartment, the air smelled of old dust and leaking radiator pipes. She didn't turn on the lights. She just dropped her coat on the floor and sank onto the second-hand sofa, pulling her laptop from her bag. The screen cast a harsh blue glow in the dark room. She opened the job boards. Nanny needed. Au pair required. Childcare specialist sought. She scrolled past the agencies that had already blacklisted her for lacking the proper aesthetic. She scrolled past the part-time gigs that barely paid minimum wage. She was scrolling so fast she almost missed it. The ad was buried on a generic, text-heavy classifieds forum. It didn't have a corporate logo. It didn't have a list of absurd demands about organic meal prep or classical music conditioning. It was 4 sentences long. Caregiver needed for 5-year-old boy. Must be observant, quiet, and absolutely entirely discreet. Live in. High risk, high compensation. Leave your number. It read less like a job posting and more like a ransom note. Fiona hovered her cursor over the reply button. High risk. What did that even mean? A kid with severe medical needs? A high-profile celebrity dodging paparazzi? Her thumb rested on the trackpad. She thought about the pink slip coming to her door in the morning. She thought about the smell of the damp cardboard boxes piled near the dumpster in the alley, the ones she might be sleeping under by the end of the week. Cynicism was a luxury for people with savings accounts. Fiona typed her phone number into the blank box and hit send. She closed the laptop, pulled a frayed blanket over her legs, and stared at the ceiling. She expected nothing. It was probably a scam, a data mining bot. 2 hours later, at exactly 1:14 a.m., her phone rang. Fiona jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. The screen displayed an unknown number. No caller ID. She cleared the sleep from her throat, and answered. "Hello?" "Fiona," a voice said. It wasn't a question. It was a low, gravelly baritone that sounded like it had been scraped over concrete. "You applied for the position." "I did." "Who is this?" "Pack a bag. Enough for a week. A car will be at your curb in 20 minutes. Fiona sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. Her survival instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of poverty, flared instantly. "Excuse me. It's 1 a.m. I don't even know who you are. I'm not getting into a strange car." There was a brief silence on the line. Then the voice spoke again, devoid of any inflection. "Your rent is $1,050 a month. You are currently in arrears. The car will be a black Lincoln. The driver's name is Dean. He will hand you an envelope with $5,000 in cash before you get in. That is your interview fee. If you don't like the terms when you arrive, you keep the money. And Dean drives you back." Fiona's breath hitched. $5,000. It was enough to clear her debt. It was enough to eat something other than instant ramen for months. 19 minutes, the man said, and the line went dead. She didn't think. If she thought about it, she would freeze. She threw a handful of clothes, her toothbrush, and her rusted lock-blade knife into a canvas duffel bag. When she stepped out onto the rain-slicked pavement of her street, the black Lincoln was already idling at the curb. The window rolled down. A thick-necked man in a dark suit looked at her. He didn't smile. He simply reached out and handed her a thick, manila envelope. Fiona took it. It was heavy. She peeled back the flap and saw the crisp edges of $100 bills. She looked at the driver. "Where are we going?" "North," Dean said. "Get in." The drive took nearly an hour. The dense, towering skyline of the city eventually gave way to winding, unlit roads framed by ancient oak trees. The properties out here were massive, hidden behind wrought-iron gates and dense foliage. The Lincoln slowed, turning off the main road onto a private drive. There was no mailbox, no address marker, just a pair of imposing steel gates that slid open silently as they approached. Fiona gripped the strap of her duffel bag, her knuckles white. The house, if you could call it that, was a sprawling, brutalist structure of dark stone and reinforced glass. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end bunker. Dean parked near the entrance. He didn't open the door for her. He just nodded toward the heavy oak front door. "Straight inside. Kitchen is down the hall to the left." Fiona stepped out into the freezing drizzle. The silence of the property was oppressive. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves. Just a dead, heavy quiet. She pushed open the front door. It wasn't locked. The foyer was massive, stripped of the usual wealthy trappings. There were no chandeliers or abstract paintings. The floors were polished concrete. The walls were bare. It felt cold. She walked down the hallway, her wet boots squeaking faintly. To her left, warm yellow light spilled out from an open doorway. The smell of burnt butter and coffee hit her nose. She stepped into the kitchen. It was a chef's kitchen, all stainless steel and dark marble, but it looked like a bomb had gone off in it. Dirty pans were stacked in the sink. A carton of milk was sitting on the island, sweating. Sitting on the marble counter was a little boy. He looked about 5 years old. He wore faded Batman pajamas, his dark hair a messy bird's nest on his head. He was swinging his legs, staring blankly at the floor. Standing in front of the stove was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing black slacks and a white Oxford shirt. The sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. As Fiona stepped further into the room, the man turned. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. The man's face was sharp, handsome in a rough, weathered way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of flint. But that wasn't what stopped her. It was the blood. The left side of his crisp white shirt was sprayed with dark, rusting crimson. There was a smear of it across his knuckles. He held a wooden spoon in one hand and a ringing cell phone in the other. He didn't look like a tech billionaire. He didn't look like a hedge fund manager. He looked like a man who had just crawled out of a war zone. He looked at Fiona. His eyes swept over her cheap coat, her damp hair, her canvas bag. "You're Fiona," he said. It was the voice from the phone. "Yes." She fought to keep her voice steady, refusing to let her gaze linger on the bloodstains. "And you are?" "Vincent." He tossed the wooden spoon into the sink with a clatter. He walked over to the island, pulled a printed piece of paper from his pocket, and dropped it onto the marble. Fiona recognized the layout. It was her resume. 52 applications in the last month," Vincent said, leaning against the counter. He crossed his arms. "Rejected by every high-end agency in the tri-state area." "Why?" Fiona lifted her chin. She was terrified, but she was also incredibly tired of being judged by rich men. "Because I don't speak French, I don't play the cello, and I told a venture capitalist that his parenting strategy was actively harming his toddler's emotional development." Vincent stared at her. For a second, nothing moved in his face. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched. He picked up her resume, tore it precisely in half, and dropped the pieces into the trash can. "Good," Vincent said. "I don't need a chemist. I need someone to keep Toby alive." He gestured to the boy on the counter. Toby hadn't looked up once. He hadn't reacted to Fiona's entrance or the ripping of the paper. He just kept staring at the floor. "He hasn't spoken in 6 months, Vincent said, his voice dropping slightly, the gravelly edge softening just a fraction. "Not a word. The last 3 nannies I hired quit within a week. They said he was too difficult. They said my schedule was too erratic." "Your schedule?" Fiona repeated, her eyes drifting back to the red spatter on his shirt. "Is that what we're calling it?" Vincent's gaze hardened. "I run a very complicated logistics organization. Sometimes the logistics get messy. The people who work for me know better than to ask questions. You are here to do exactly one thing. You watch the boy. You feed him. You keep him away from the windows." Fiona blinked. "Away from the windows?" Before Vincent could answer, a loud, sharp crack echoed from the front of the house. It sounded like heavy glass shattering, followed by a shouted curse. Fiona didn't gasp. She didn't scream. The instincts forged in the worst neighborhoods of the city took over instantly. In 2 strides, she crossed the kitchen, grabbed Toby off the marble counter, and dropped to the floor, pulling the boy's head against her chest and tucking him behind the thick wooden base of the island. She waited for the gunfire. She waited for the screaming. Instead, a man in a leather jacket walked into the kitchen, holding a bleeding hand. "Boss, the new kid dropped the crate. Front door glass is shattered." Vincent didn't look at the bleeding man. He was looking over the counter, staring down at Fiona where she knelt on the floor, her body instinctively curled around his son. Toby was looking up at Fiona, his small hands clutching the lapels of her cheap wet coat. Vincent exhaled slowly. He turned to the man in the leather jacket. "Clean it up. Get out." The man nodded and scrambled out of the kitchen. Fiona slowly let go of Toby. She stood up, brushing the dust off her knees. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained entirely stoic. Vincent watched her intently. He pushed away from the counter and walked over to a heavy oak cabinet. He opened a drawer, pulled out a thick stack of banded cash, and tossed it onto the island. Next to it, he placed a heavy, matte black handgun. $250,000 a year, Vincent said, his voice quiet now, deadly serious. Tax-free, room and board. You don't leave the estate without a security detail. You don't take pictures. You don't invite friends over. Fiona looked at the money. Then she looked at the gun. She reached out. She didn't touch the cash. She placed her hand flat against the cold metal of the gun and slid it across the marble, pushing it away from where Toby was standing. "Put that away," Fiona said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He's 5. Vincent looked at the gun, then back to her face. Something shifted in his eyes. The cold, impenetrable wall of the mob boss cracked just for a second, revealing the exhausted, desperate father underneath. "You start right now," Vincent said. The first week was a masterclass in aggressive silence. The house operated on a frequency of muted violence. Men in dark clothes came and went through the service entrance at odd hours, their boots heavy on the concrete, their conversations clipped and hushed. Nobody spoke to Fiona. Nobody even looked at her. She was a ghost who made peanut butter sandwiches. That was fine by her. She had spent her entire life invisible to men with money. These men just happened to carry semi-automatic weapons instead of briefcases. Her primary objective was Toby. The boy was a ghost himself. He didn't cry. He didn't throw tantrums. He simply existed, moving from the bed to the floor to the kitchen stool with the limp compliance of a rag doll. The previous nannies had left behind detailed, color-coded schedules, mandated reading times, classical music immersion, organic, gluten-free meal plans. Fiona gathered the binders on Tuesday morning and threw them into the commercial incinerator out back. She replaced the classical music with the low, steady hum of the television, playing old cartoons. She replaced the organic kale chips with generic macaroni and cheese, the kind that stained the water an unnatural shade of orange. She didn't try to force Toby to speak. She didn't crouch down, put on a high-pitched voice, and demand his attention. She just sat near him. She folded laundry on the floor while he stared at the wall. She ate her cereal at the island while he pushed a toy car back and forth over the same 3 inches of marble. She let him simply be a kid who was allowed to be broken for a little while. On Thursday, it rained again. A heavy, relentless downpour that turned the sprawling estate into a muddy swamp. Fiona found Toby standing by the reinforced glass of the living room window, his small hands pressed flat against the pane. He was watching the water pool in the dirt. Fiona walked over. She didn't say a word. She just grabbed his yellow rain boots, the ones that looked entirely unused, and set them on the floor next to him. Toby looked at the boots. Then he looked up at her. His eyes, the exact same shade of flint as his father's, held a flicker of something. Confusion. Fiona pulled on her own worn, duct-taped boots. She opened the heavy front door. The security guard stationed on the porch, a thick-set man named Brody, stepped forward, his hand dropping to his hip. "Where are you going?" Brody barked, the rain dripping off the brim of his cap. "Outside," Fiona said. "Boss said he stays inside. Security protocol." Fiona didn't blink. The perimeter gate is locked. There are 6 men patrolling the wall, and the nearest public road is 2 miles away. We are going to step into the mud for exactly 10 minutes, so this child can remember what fresh air smells like. If you want to shoot me for it, Brody, aim for center mass. Brody stared at her, his jaw working. He looked at the scrawny woman in the cheap coat, then down at the 5-year-old boy peering around her leg. Slowly, Brody stepped back and crossed his arms. Fiona held out her hand. Toby hesitated. He looked at the open door, then at the rain, then at her outstretched palm. Very slowly, his small, cold fingers slipped into hers. They walked out into the rain. Fiona didn't try to protect him from the downpour. She let the water soak into his hair. She led him to a large puddle near the driveway. She stepped into it, splashing muddy water onto the cuffs of her jeans. She looked at Toby. He looked at the puddle. He tentatively raised one yellow boot and brought it down. A small splash. Fiona stomped harder. Toby stomped back. For 10 minutes, the millionaire mob boss's son and the broke, evicted nanny jumped in the mud. Toby didn't laugh. He didn't smile. But as Fiona wiped the wet dirt from his cheek with her thumb before they went back inside, his breathing was faster. The dead, hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a real, living child. When they walked back into the foyer, dripping water onto the polished concrete, Vincent was standing at the end of the hall. He was wearing a dark suit, impeccably tailored, but his tie was loosened and the top button of his shirt was undone. He looked exhausted. He looked at the muddy footprints trailing across his pristine floor. He looked at Fiona's soaked hair. He looked at the mud smeared across his son's face. Fiona braced herself. She waited for the yelling. She waited to be fired. She mentally calculated if the $5,000 in her duffel bag would be enough to get her a bus ticket out of state. Vincent didn't yell. He walked slowly down the hall, stopping a few feet from them. He knelt down, his expensive slacks pressing directly into a muddy puddle on the floor. He didn't seem to notice or care. He reached out and gently touched Toby's wet cheek. "Mud," Vincent said softly. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual commanding edge. Toby looked at his father. For a long, agonizing second, the boy just stared. Then he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Vincent closed his eyes. A long, shaky breath escaped his lungs. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for 6 months. He stood up, avoiding Fiona's gaze. He didn't say thank you. He didn't acknowledge what she had done. He simply turned and walked into his study, shutting the heavy oak door behind him. Fiona stood in the hallway, the dripping water loud in the sudden silence. She realized then that Vincent wasn't paying her to watch his son. He was paying her to save him. Life in the fortress settled into a rhythm. It wasn't normal, but it was predictable. Fiona learned the rules. She learned that Dean preferred his coffee black, and that Brody was terrified of spiders. She learned that the heavy black SUV arriving at midnight meant bad news, and the sleek grey sedan arriving at dawn meant a problem had been solved. Mostly, she learned about Vincent through the spaces he left behind. She found cold cups of black coffee on the edge of the bathtub. She found legal pads covered in erratic, heavy handwriting, filled with numbers and initials she knew better than to read. She saw him passing in the hallways, a broad-shouldered shadow moving through the house, always on the phone, always dealing with a crisis. They rarely spoke. When they did, it was purely transactional. We need more milk. Toby needs new shoes. Keep him in the East Wing tomorrow. It was a Tuesday night, exactly 3 weeks after Fiona had arrived. The house was dead quiet. Toby was asleep, exhausted from an afternoon of building a massive, structurally unsound fort out of sofa cushions. Fiona was in the kitchen, sitting on a stool under a single pendant light, eating a bowl of cold cereal. The heavy front door clicked open. Heavy, dragging footsteps echoed down the hall. Vincent walked into the kitchen. He didn't notice her at first. He walked straight to the sink, gripped the marble edge with both hands, and hung his head. He was breathing hard, short, ragged gasps that rattled in his chest. He was wearing a black, long-sleeved shirt, but the fabric over his left shoulder was wet. It clung to him, heavy and shining darkly in the dim light. Fiona put her spoon down. The ceramic clinked loudly. Vincent's head snapped up. His right hand blurred toward his waistband, stopping only when he saw it was her. He exhaled, his posture sagging against the counter. "You should be asleep," he muttered, his voice tight with pain. "You're bleeding on the floor," Fiona replied, her voice perfectly level. She didn't panic. Panic was useless. Vincent looked down. A steady drip of crimson was pooling on the pristine concrete. It's fine. Grazed. It's not fine. It's making a mess. Fiona stood up. She walked over to the heavy oak cabinet near the pantry. She knew where the medical kit was. She had found it on her second day. It wasn't a standard first aid box. It was a military-grade trauma kit. She pulled it out, brought it to the island, and unzipped it. "Take the shirt off." Vincent stared at her, his jaw tight. "I have a doctor. He's on his way. Unless your doctor is currently pulling into the driveway, you're going to bleed out over your expensive shoes." "Take the shirt off, Vincent." It was the first time she had used his name. It felt heavy in her mouth. He didn't argue. He slowly, painfully, peeled the ruined shirt over his head, wincing as the fabric pulled away from the wound. Fiona suppressed a flinch. His torso was a map of old violence. Pale scars crisscrossed his ribs and stomach, but her focus was on his shoulder. A bullet had torn through the meaty part of his deltoid. It wasn't fatal, but it was deep, and it was ugly. She grabbed a bottle of antiseptic, soaked a thick gauze pad, and stepped right up to him. "This is going to burn." She didn't wait for him to brace himself. She pressed the gauze directly into the wound. Vincent's entire body went rigid. The muscles in his arms locked, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the marble counter. But he didn't make a sound. He didn't even gasp. He just stared straight ahead, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. Fiona worked quickly, her hand steady. Years of patching up scraped knees and busted lips on the playground translated surprisingly well to gunshot wounds, minus the weeping. She cleaned the torn flesh, applied a heavy layer of clotting agent, and tightly wrapped a pressure bandage around his shoulder and chest. They were standing inches apart. The smell of copper and sweat radiated off his skin, mixing with the cold rain from outside. "You have steady hands," Vincent said. His voice was a low rumble in his chest, so close she could feel the vibration. "I grew up in the South Side," Fiona said, tying off the bandage. "You learn not to shake when things get messy." She stepped back, tossing the bloody gauze into the trash. She walked to the sink and washed her hands, watching the pink water swirl down the drain. Vincent watched her. He picked up a clean towel from the counter and wiped his face. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made him look a decade older. "Why did you stay?" he asked. The question hung in the quiet kitchen, heavy and entirely unshielded. Fiona dried her hands. She turned around and leaned against the sink. "You pay me $250,000 a year." Vincent let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "There isn't enough money in the world to make a sane person stay in this house. You've seen the guns. You've seen the blood. You know exactly what I am. Yet, you don't flinch. You don't hide." "I don't have the luxury of hiding," Fiona said, her voice turning sharp. "I don't care what you do outside this house. I don't care who you threaten or who you hurt. That's your business. But inside this house, you're a disaster. You're a ghost to your own kid." Vincent's eyes darkened, the dangerous edge returning instantly. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Fiona shot back, pushing off the sink. She wasn't intimidated. She was angry. "You'll fire me? You'll shoot me? Go ahead, but don't pretend you're a victim of circumstance. Toby didn't stop speaking because of a medical condition. He stopped speaking because his environment is a war zone, and his father is a stranger covered in blood. You want him to heal? Stop leaving your loaded weapons on the counter. Stop letting men with hollow-point bullets guard the cereal pantry." Silence descended on the kitchen. It was thick, suffocating. Vincent took a slow step toward her. He was massive, an imposing wall of muscle and scars, staring down at her with an intensity that would have made hardened criminals break. Fiona held her ground. She tilted her chin up, meeting his stare. For a long moment, the air crackled. The absolute authority of the Mafia boss clashing against the immovable, cynical reality of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Then, Vincent dropped his gaze. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at the empty bowl of cereal on the counter. "You're right," he said quietly. The admission sounded like it physically pained him to say. "I don't know how to do this. I know how to break things. I know how to dismantle threats. I don't know how to be a father to a boy who breaks when I raise my voice." He looked back at her. The cold, dead expression was gone. He just looked like a man drowning. "Help him, Fiona," Vincent whispered. "I don't care what it costs. Just fix him." "He's not a broken car engine, Vincent," she said, her tone softening just a fraction. "He's a little boy. I can't fix him alone. You have to be here. You have to wash the blood off before you walk through that door." Vincent nodded slowly. He reached out, his uninjured arm moving carefully. He didn't grab her. He just lightly wrapped his hand around her forearm. His palm was calloused and warm. "Teach me," he said. Fiona looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up into his eyes. She knew in that exact second that the line between employee and something far more dangerous had just permanently blurred. She was no longer just the nanny. She was the anchor, holding a monster tethered to his humanity. "Okay," Fiona said. "We start tomorrow, at breakfast, and you're making the pancakes." Did Fiona just make the biggest mistake of her life? Or did she finally find a place where her survival instincts are a commodity? The lines between employee and accomplice are about to blur. If you want to see how deep into the underworld Fiona is pulled, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Part 3 drops tomorrow. And trust me, the blood is just starting to spill.